glad to be here with you this afternoon to talk about comprehensible input. My name is Michelle, and I teach French at Hershey High School in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And I sometimes actually smell chocolate when I'm working, which is pretty cool. Not too many people can say that, but it's a lovely little community, and I have great students, and I'm very, very happy with my job. And comprehensible input plays a really big role in what I do with my students. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about that. Before I do that, I want to make a disclaimer really quickly. I don't necessarily consider myself a CI expert, but I do consider myself a very loyal practitioner of comprehensible input. And I like to read and discuss and stay current. I like to do experiments in my classroom. And I try to surround myself with smart people, smart colleagues, and people around me. And, you know, I really want to do the best for my students. And when you begin to look at comprehensible input and why you do it, it becomes a journey, not just, you know, something to try or do. It's really something that you embrace and begin to move forward with. So I'm going to move on here. Let's see. So the first thing I want you to do is to imagine your perfect class. And I don't mean like the students, although that might be a small part of it. And I don't mean the classroom necessarily. I just want you to imagine. So if you even have a piece of paper in front of you and you want to jot down some of these ideas, imagine a perfect class. Like, what does the room look like? How is it set up? What does it look like? What activities are taking place? What's your ideal go-to home run activity? What are the students doing? What are you doing as the teacher? And what does the classroom feel like? What is the feeling that you get when you're in the classroom? Now, I'm not sure what you're writing down, but I'm imagining that none of you are imagining a classroom where the students are just quietly working on a packet or worksheets. In your perfect class, you're imagining your students speaking, in my case, French, and speaking the language, the target language that you're trying to teach, that they're speaking it to you, to each other, that they're enjoying themselves. Maybe there's laughter, but maybe it's a serious topic, but there's discussion. There is target language use going on. And as language teachers, that's really our ultimate goal, is to really get students to speak. And to be honest with you, when you talk to your students, that's what they really want to do, is be able to speak. All right, I want you to put aside that paper, those ideas about your perfect class, and we're going to come back to it a little later. So I have a quote that I like to use in my presentations that says, "A given teacher's methods are only as good as his or her belief system and organizing linguistic principles." This is by John D'Amato. And I really like this quote because it really made me stop and think, well, what do I believe about how language is learned or acquired, and how students learn best, and what are my beliefs and organizing principles that I use to ask myself questions about the strategies or the techniques that I'm using in my classroom. And I think it's important that you think about that. What do you believe about language teaching and learning? And what exactly do you seem to promote in your classroom because of a belief that you have? And I think it'll help you as we go through today when you think about that. So I'm here today to talk to you about Dr. Stephen Krashen and his theory of comprehensible input, or his hypothesis, excuse me, of comprehensible input. And Dr. Krashen wrote a book called The Natural Approach with a man named, I'm assuming doctor as well, Tracy Terrell. And he is a professor emeritus at the University of Southern California. He's a linguist, an educational researcher, and an activist. And You're going to get to see, he's my hero. I really love Stephen Krashen and his ideas, and it's transformed my teaching. I actually saw Dr. Krashen. I'm going to move on from this photo, though, because it is not my favorite. I actually met Dr. Krashen very early, before I ever heard of comprehensible input or taught really for many years. A friend of mine drugged me to a talk that he was doing, and I was really mesmerized by what he said, but I couldn't figure out how that would make sense. And it wasn't until years later that I went to a session on TPRS with Blaine Ray, and I began to understand how that was fleshing out. So in front of you, you have the tenets, the major tenets of the comprehensible input hypothesis. This is really broken down, but here's basically what it says. That we acquire language when we understand what people tell us, we understand what we read, and we are absorbed in the message. So this is kind of interesting. You know, we acquire language when we understand what people tell us. So when we're hearing, listening, we understand when we read, so that's reading, and we're absorbed in the message. It's kind of interesting because there's something that's noticeably absent from this definition that we as language educators typically believe impacts language acquisition, and that's production. There's no speaking, there's no writing mentioned in this hypothesis. It says only that we acquire language when we understand what we hear and understand what we read, and then that added bonus of not thinking about the fact that we are in the target language. I wanted to point out that ACTFL actually supports this statement, or excuse me, the hypothesis, with a statement that it made on comprehensible input. This particular picture that you see is from the Keys to Planning for Learning. I believe it's on page 45, if I'm not mistaken. And it talks about a mindset for lesson plan design, and it says that these three things down at the bottom, which is the 90% use, the comprehensible input, and the planning for transitions, are critical factors that provide structural support for the lesson and maximize potential for learning. And I was very excited when I saw this, because I was already a believer in comprehensible input. And when I read this during a PLC with my department, I was really excited to see that comprehensible input got a billing for this particular topic and in this book about planning and learning. There's also a language educator magazine issue that was all about comprehensible input, and it is mentioned quite often in different scenarios. So I need to point out first, and this is really important too, that comprehensible input is a philosophy or a mindset. It's not a strategy, it's not a technique. Because comprehensible input answers the question, how does language acquisition occur? How does it happen? And how do people get language into their long-term memories so that it's accessible at any moment to be used and to be used to communicate? So I think it's important to make the distinction between a philosophy and a strategy. A philosophy is a belief system. It is a starting point where you begin to decide what you're going to do in your classroom, and you use this as sort of like a stake in the ground, so to speak. And this is where you use it as a kind of like something solid that you move around from and decide what strategies you're going to use. They're all going to stem from your belief system and your philosophy about language acquisition. And I'm here to talk to you about CI and to unpack a little bit about what it means, to explain it, and then talk to you about why it's so powerful in our world language classrooms. So the comprehensible input hypothesis, just to remind you again, says when we acquire language when we understand what people tell us and we understand what we read, and we're absorbed in the message. And this is my working definition of acquire. In fact, it's how I explain it to my students. I say that we acquire language means we have it. accessible to us in our long-term memory, that we can pull it out and use it whenever we need it. And I think the kids really understand that, and I think it works well with teachers too. What do the kids have right at their disposal? What language is there that they don't have to look up, that they don't have to, plan 20 minutes ahead of time what they're going to say, that they just have spontaneously? And that is what acquisition is. It's language that's just internalized already. So among these particular, with this hypothesis, there will be some paradigm shifts or some ways of thinking about language acquisition that are going to change, because already we recognize that there's no speaking in here, and there's no writing, there's no grammar listed, because in Krashen's hypothesis, he says that this is the way that we learn it. So I'm going to talk to you about a few paradigm shifts first. So I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly. The first one is that everyone can acquire a second language. So this paradigm shift, if this is how people learn language and acquire language, everyone can do it, not just the smart kids, not just the kids with honors, not just the students that are good in language or in English or math or what have you. Everyone can. The second one is that students learn language based on meaning, not form, meaning grammar. They learn language based on what it means, not on its function in a sentence. So no one is learning a language based on function. It isn't something that happens. They are learning it based on what it means to them and how they can use it in logical ways. The next one is, and this is not usually one that people disagree with, but how a student feels about himself and his abilities in the second language impacts how much he acquires. And my question there is, how do we as teachers influence this? What's our role in affect and the affective filter and the way that people feel? And lastly, I really believe a paradigm shift in our thinking needs to be that the expectations of the learner, what we expect from the learner, must be realistic. What should our end goals be? All right, so every time I'm going to address a new paradigm shift, you're going to see this screen. And here we go. Everyone can learn a language because language is acoustical, not intellectual. So the first time I heard this message was quite a few years ago with my mentor, Susan Gross, who pretty much taught me everything I know about CI and that I still use and do today. And when she said this in her session, language is acoustical, not intellectual, it made me realize that, yeah, you don't have to be smart to learn a language. You don't have to have a certain IQ. There are people with low IQs and people with mental challenges that use language all the time because it's an auditory, acoustical thing. In addition, there is also sign language, which is not necessarily an auditory thing, but it also has meaning associated with a sign, which is also tells you that it's just something that people can learn, whether it's auditory or visual, that represents ideas and thoughts. And language can be used by any of those people. Everyone can learn a second language. The fact that a student already speaks a language means that she is capable of learning another one. She has what she needs physically, mentally, and emotionally to learn a language, to learn a second one. And so it's important that we remember that that is always out there for us, that people have this ability to learn a second language because they already know their first one. But the big question then is, to what extent can the student learn the language, and what should our goals be, which is where we're going to end up at the end. So just a little anecdotally, it's kind of fun, but all children can become fluent because moms all over the world have a 100% success rate. This is how kids learn language, is by their caregiver, spending time talking to them, providing language to them. There's lots of research that's being done on the amount of vocabulary that students have when they come into school. This is all research that supports the comprehensible input hypothesis, that kids are listening, reading, speaking, interacting with adults, and gaining language, gaining vocabulary. And this all stems from the same idea. Of course, this is barring any physical or mental challenges that a child might have, but children can become fluent, and moms have been doing it for centuries. So language is acoustical, not intellectual. To speak, children only must hear and understand. It's kind of fascinating. Researchers are still trying to uncover exactly how language is acquired. We don't really know. These are all hypotheses, like we said, and things, but this is the kind of stuff that we're picking up new, scientists are finding new ways to explain what is happening with language acquisition all the time. Think about your first language. You only heard it, you made meaning, and you began to understand, and then later you were able to use it yourself. So we don't require babies or toddlers to understand grammar as they're acquiring language. There's no parent that gives doesn't rock their child to sleep saying, I am, you are, he is, she is. We don't conjugate verbs while we're talking to our kids. We just use them in regular logical ways. And we don't require them to do any kind of grammar assessments. The other thing that I want to mention is that many people acquire language without formal training. I often think of Uber drivers or taxi drivers in different locations, and it's kind of interesting to see that they speak English well and they've learned it on the job, and they have not had any formal training. So language is something that can be learned without a teacher. That's kind of sad for us in a way, but if we can learn how to harness the way that language is learned, we can really make an impact in our classrooms. So I have a question for you. Why do children say he don't? You know, did all these kids miss the same day in 3rd grade when they were doing the worksheet between he don't and he doesn't and have them pick the right thing? No, they probably didn't miss the worksheet. They probably did it, but it didn't stick because language is acoustical, not intellectual. He don't, kids that say he don't come from families that say he don't, and people around them that say he don't, and communities that say he don't. So it sounds natural, it sounds right, it doesn't sound wrong to them. That's why he don't keeps getting said, and other phrases that are like that. So let's take a minute to reflect for a second. The question I want to ask is, how often have we heard this child can't learn a foreign language? The real question though is, are we teaching language the way that all students can learn it? I'm not saying it's not a challenge. There are kids that are really challenged with learning a language, but I am saying that as we continue to think about our techniques and our strategies and our philosophies about language acquisition, we have to recognize that maybe it's something that we're doing that isn't helping kids to learn or to acquire language the way we'd like them to. Just really quickly, what does the first language experience look like? So think about that for a minute. Maybe if you have a toddler at home, you can picture this perfectly. If you think about other people who have children, or maybe remember from your own childhood what it was like, but you can probably picture it. Who does most of the talking? It's mom or dad or a caregiver. How much does the child talk? At the beginning, not much at all. It's a silent period. There isn't much time that children are spent talking until, like, I don't know, a year to 2 years. That first year is pretty much silent. Now they're making noises, but they're not actually communicating other than crying, which does communicate, I have to say, but they are not necessarily talking. Definitely not in complete sentences. What do we talk about when you're learning your first one? What do parents talk to their children about? Everything that's around them. what they're experiencing, who they're with, what's happening, what they're eating. They do things, they talk about their life, their world, and what's around them. And the other thing is that we know the child understands how. Well, by their response. It could be a physical response. It could be where they actually get up and do something. They respond to a command. But it could also just be that they laugh at the right time, or smile when they're supposed to, or, you know, shake their head. There's a lot that kids show us without using speech, that they understand what's happening. And remember, the comprehensible input hypothesis tells us that they only need to hear and understand and read and understand to acquire language. So kids are acquiring language, and we know this is true, while they're not speaking. All right, so there is this thing called input, comprehensible input, and we're going to talk about what it means to give input versus output. And I think you're probably definitely catching on to this. To take a look at the classroom, we really need to look at input and output. So in the typical traditional L2 classroom, the first question I have is, what is output? Assuming you know this, or you can guess, that output is your writing and your speaking. That's when you are producing the language. You are giving output. Input, on the other hand, is the listening and the reading. Remember that we acquire languages in only one way, Dr. Stephen Krashen says, when we understand messages, through comprehensible input. So let's take a look here. A traditional class that's taught in a traditional high school second language class versus what mom would do at home in mom's class to learn a language. Now, I know kids are different ages, but I still think these same ideas apply. The traditional class often provides very little input and expects output from day one. And I would like to go on to say that if they do provide input, it's usually incomprehensible. The kids don't understand what the teacher's saying. But output is expected very early on. Repeat after me, say these words, before there's any kind of connection to the understanding of what those words mean. However, mom's class is almost all input from mom for about 2 years. And that's all the child is getting. They're getting input from mom, comprehensible input, where the mom keeps talking and making it comprehensible, checking for the child's understanding. All right. The next, the traditional class it demands complete sentences usually, and it really forces kids to be accurate. But if you think about mom's class, which is what we're trying to emulate a little bit more, it just requires comprehension through actions and one-word answers without grammatical accuracy. So kids can show, students can show, and children can show that they understand through going to pick up their juice cup or answering with one word, yes, no, doctor, boy, whatever. And they don't have to be grammatically accurate when they do speak. Now, input, I believe, is what inspires output. It's a lot like fueling your body, fueling a car. You need things to fuel you so that you have energy. You're a better speaker of French. It's very connected, listening and speaking. And then I believe that reading in Spanish, for example, makes you a better writer of Spanish. And I think that these are important factors that we need to recognize, that when what we usually do is we just make them write more or make them speak more, but really they need more fuel. They need more input. They need more sustenance to be able to do the things that we're asking them to do. Carol Gobb says that every successful language learner has had access to a great deal of comprehensible input. This is why they can do it. So for example, when a student goes, we often say when a student goes abroad, they can learn the language faster because they're in, it's exactly true. They can learn when they live in a country where the target language is spoken all the time. They can learn a language or acquire the language much more quickly and accurately than what they can do with 40 minutes a day over the course of a school year, because it's around them all the time. A great deal of CI. There is this thing that's real called the silent period. And this is where the child and the adult learner can be too, but any learner of a language is trying to build a competence, and they're trying to understand what's happening around them. And speaking emerges on its own after enough competence has been developed through listening and understanding. If you think about it, the average child needs about 2 years of listening up to input before he or she can speak in simple sentences. And that's really, not all 2-year-olds speak in sentences. Sometimes it's longer. The average child needs about 2 years of personal reading. They start reading in like maybe first grade, second grade, and before they can really write simple sentences that are spelled correctly, that have, good syntax. It takes a long time for them to do that. So we're talking about a lot of acquisition years, and it is a silent period. There's also a natural order of linguistic elements that students acquire when they are developmentally ready, and that's a whole other ballgame too. But I think it's important to note that a silent period is important. A lot of our classrooms, unfortunately, force output. Adults and children in formal classes, they're not allowed to have a silent period, and they're asked to produce very, very early on. Years ago, I was teaching 6th grade, and I decided I was teaching all the things like bonjour, ça va, comment ça va, those kinds of things, and I was teaching them through, practicing and talking to neighbors and so forth. And I wrote a dialogue between SpongeBob and Patrick, and it just had hello, how are you, and had some things in it. And I used a word in there. I showed them what it meant. The whole thing was written in French, but the one word was maintenant, which means now. And they had never heard it before. They had never seen it before. And I just put it in there, and I put the word now in parentheses so they would know what it meant. Well, then, I don't know why I did this, but I asked them to read it, and they were reading it with each other. And their pronunciation was beautiful as they were reading through these words until they got to maintenant. They had never heard it. They didn't know what it sounded like. They still had no concept in 6th grade early on, the first couple weeks, as to how to pronounce things. They knew how to pronounce what they knew. They did not know how to pronounce what they didn't know. And so they would revert to English to pronounce the words. And that's exactly what happens to our students. That's why their pronunciation is so terrible. They just haven't heard enough language for them to be able to do it early on. That's why it is. Reflection. How does our traditional teaching, specifically with grammar, force output? We're forcing them to write before they're ready. We're forcing them to speak before they're ready. And the question is, what's the result? Are we getting the results we want? I believe that students will know how to say the things that they regularly hear and understand. So if you want them to say something, you have to use that regularly in your speech. They will repeat it, they will use it, they will recreate with it, and they will have it in their long-term memory at their disposal. Okay, we're ready for another paradigm shift. This one is people learn language based on meaning, not form. So people learn language based on meaning, not grammar, because to most kids, they're just words. They are just words that mean things. They're not functions, they're not prepositions, they're not adjectives, they're not past tense verbs. They're just words that mean things, and students don't really know. I have a very intelligent students, and the other day I just said to them, by the way, can you guys conjugate the verb to be in English? And they had a really hard time doing that. And I thought that was really interesting. There was definitely hesitation there, and they weren't sure exactly what they should say. They didn't know the words. They had to really think through it. So it definitely, for kids, they're just words. They're not grammar focuses. Interestingly enough, CI focuses on meaning. students listen and understand. They absorb grammar without being explicitly taught. And they're capable of using complex grammar without understanding the rules behind it. They use the words that they hear you use and that they see you use in your writing. For example, when I taught 6th grade also, just because I believed this so much, I decided to do an experiment, and I actually used a construction of the subjunctive in my 6th grade in a reading that they were going to read. I think I used it in their story as well, but I had never tried that before. It had never crossed my mind, but I thought, this makes sense. It was about a girl who wanted a cat, and there was a boy, and he had 2 cats, and so he decided to give 1 cat to the girl, and he did it because he didn't want her to be sad. And in French, it's he doesn't want her to be sad. Il ne veut pas qu'elle soit triste. So the kids were able to figure out what soit meant without any issue, and they never asked me about that form. They didn't care that it was the subjunctive, and of course I never taught that to them in 6th grade. The other thing that CI does is we use comprehensible input teachers focus on pop-ups. In their pop-up grammar, we call it. When we're reading something or through a story that we're telling, we do really quick explanations of grammar, but we do the same explanation of the grammar over the course of time, probably 100 times. We do that quick little question, explanation. Why is it like this? What ending does this need? If I were to change it to this, what would it be? This is the way that grammar is taught because we focus on what things mean and what they mean in the context of their sentences. You've probably maybe heard the phrase where it says we shelter vocabulary but not grammar, a small context with a rich grammar. So we really want to make sure that we are not giving them too much vocabulary, but we're using the grammar that would typically and normally be used in the target culture. And this is kind of a huge paradigm shift because in comprehensible input teaching, there really is almost no explicit grammar teaching. And I know that's super hard because I really liked grammar too, and it's hard to sort of say goodbye to it, but you can still do this with your pop-ups and you can still teach grammar, but you're not going to do it the way you did it before. You're not going to say something like, today we're going to introduce the past tense. Since they didn't learn that way in their first language, they really shouldn't learn it that way in their second language either. I believe that grammar and even the explanations of grammar that we love to give as teachers, they do come into play, but after a lot of exposure to the language that you want them to acquire. So that you're sort of saying, oh, when I say this or when you read this, that's what that means. And that's how you make it future. Oh, okay. And then you can use the grammar for that purpose. All right, so let's do a little comparison here. This is actually based on Krashen's writings. He takes acquisition and he juxtaposes it against learning, and he likes 2 different definitions for these words. And I know that we often use them interchangeably, and I do it too, but for this particular situation, we want to really highlight the differences between traditional learning and acquiring language. All right, so first of all, I think it's important to note that Krashen says that both of these can improve language. Both of these can really make an impact on a student's language abilities. But the amount of impact and the timing of the impact is different for both. Okay, so let's start off. Acquisition is effortless. We don't remember learning our first language. We don't have any acquisition for that. I feel like, I'm sorry, I'm getting a question over here. I'm trying to answer it. Just give me a second. My first question. So I have a question from Jim Nichols. He says, how can we compare the amount of time that children have in their first language to the second language classroom? And I know a lot of people say this, and I actually address this a little bit later. The disparity is great, and that's what's confusing the most about CI, is what Jim wrote. I think you're going to have an answer to that when I talk to you about the expectations. And when you come to the point where you realize that what we're expecting our students to do and we're trying to cram into them is not lasting, and they're only keeping it for so long. So we might as well work with the stuff that we can have that's going to last. If I don't answer that question completely, Jim, I can talk to you later about that, or we can converse more on Facebook if I don't address it as we go. All right, so acquisition is effortless. We don't remember how we learned our first language. It just happened, and we had this language in our bank, and now we can use it. Maybe now we know that we learn more words, but most of us don't study words. We just hear them in context. We hear someone else use them, and then we use that word another time. However, learning involves study. It's, according to Krashen, learning involves actual study where you have to sit down and you have to memorize and you have to spend time using it, or spend time, looking at it, studying it, memorizing it. When you acquire language, it's effortless. When you acquire language, you're also all about understanding the message. You are focusing on understanding what the message is. When you study, or excuse me, when you're learning a language, you're really trying to understand the mechanics. You're more focused on the message in acquisition and more focused on the mechanics. I'm going to give you a little anecdote. I'm sure you know this, but have you ever had a kid do a conjugation worksheet or quiz, and they conjugate all the verbs perfectly, but they do not have any idea what the words mean on the page? Well, that's your choice if that's what you want to do, and maybe there's some value in them understanding the mechanics in a mechanical way, but if they really don't understand the messages, then it kind of defeats the purpose of communicating with other people. I believe that acquisition is subconscious. You don't realize you're doing it. It's something that's just happening to you. But learning is very conscious, and you are consciously practicing, and you are putting things in your brain, and you are editing, and you are just, trying to make the perfect sentence as you go. Acquisition feels like nothing is happening. You really feel like you're not doing anything. A lot of my students have a hard time articulating what we do in class. I think they're happy with what they can do, but they don't understand that us having a big, large group conversation, or me talking to them about something and us interacting, is what's helping them to acquire the language. In the learning classroom, you need to know the rules. So you have to be really conscious of what's going on, and you know what you're doing at all times. You're focusing on the rules. So just a reminder, Krashen does say that both help improve language. But what happens in a learning classroom, we get a lot of drills and a lot of practice. But what happens, and really only the best students can become fluent this way. In the CI community, we talk often about what we call the 4%ers. This was also a Susan Gross thing, I believe. She used to say, well, 4% of the population can learn that way. And I think she based it on the fact that by the time kids get to their last level of language that's offered in your school, you've usually whittled it down to a quarter of the students that you had, or excuse me, less than that, I'm bad at math, 4% of the students that you had when you started. Now, I know that might not be the case in your school, but I know that does happen in a lot of schools. So really, only the best students can really put language together like that through drills and practice. But what happens in an acquisition classroom is they get comprehensible input. They're getting input that they can understand. They understand the message they're hearing. They understand the message that they're reading. And hopefully, if the message is compelling enough, they're getting absorbed in it, and they don't realize that they're actually in the language. They're just thinking about the actual message that you're saying. And we believe in the CI community that all children can become fluent this way. And this is where I'm going to address Jim's comment. I know what you're thinking. We don't have the time. Well, I know we don't have time to allow kids to acquire language. We don't have the time for that. But I'm going to argue with you that we really don't have a choice. Most kids aren't really retaining it in the long run. And we might as well make the language that they have usable. I remember talking to a professor from Millersville University. We were in a session at the PSMLA conference that was excellent about high schools coming together with colleges and what do we want from each other and what kind of respect do we want and what do we want the students to be able to do in both levels. And the college professor said, we don't need you to teach them every tense. Can you just help them to know, to be able to be moderately fluent in the tenses that they know, the basic ones, so that they can come to us with a little bit of fluent language under their belts. And it was really, really eye-opening to me that we teach too much in too short of a time, and students don't have the time to acquire the language that they need. So really quick question, do you think learning can produce proficiency? I usually do an experiment with my students or in my presentations, so I'm going to do it with you. I want you right now at home, wherever you are, to think about your day today. Think about your morning, what you did when you got up, where you went, what you did. And I want you to be prepared, start thinking about it, to say it out loud. Now, I'm not going to obviously hear you, so that's your choice if you want to say it out loud or not. But before you start, has everyone been thinking a little bit about your day and what you're doing? Okay. Before you start, I want to give you a rule. Don't use any words that have the letter R in them. Now go. As you're thinking through what you're going to say, how many of you are noticing that you're hesitating? That you are having to pause and think before you say a word because you have to think about the rule. Well, this is exactly what we do to our students all the time when we make them think about grammar rules before they talk. And there's a couple sides to this, but we really do sometimes keep students from learning everything from, we keep them from acquiring because we're really helping them, we're making them focus on the rule, and they don't have time. And if students know the rule in the first place, they can think about it. And if the students can focus, they actually have the ability to focus on the rule at the moment of utterance. This is why kids often say, like, yo nadar, yo nadar. I'm not a Spanish teacher, so hopefully I pronounce that okay. But they don't say the correct form of the verb. They use the infinitive. Honestly, they often use the infinitive because that's what they see written on most papers. They don't see it written in any kind of a context because we always want them to conjugate the verb. All right, so the next question is, how many students can actually do this? Like, can you think about the rule and focus on it and say it? If you tried this out loud, you would have noticed that you hesitated, stuttered, paused, had to think. However, you're a native speaker of your first language. Obviously, you were doing this in your first language. Kids are doing this in their second language, and they don't know the rules as well, and they don't focus on the rules. So it's really kind of, it's hard for kids to be able to do this. And we sometimes, what do I want to say? We actually stymie their growth because we expect them to do these kinds of things. So the result is this. I think that acquisition produces fluent language use. Language that rolls off the tongue. Now, notice I didn't say perfectly accurate language. I just said fluent, that they're talking, they're using the language, and they're communicating. And learning really produces the ability to edit, where you pause, where you think, you try to say the right word. Remember, don't forget, Krashen says both can be helpful. But really, this last one is what Krashen calls the monitor hypothesis. So acquisition is listening for meaning, reading for meaning. Learning is spelling and grammar and how the language works. I think both are needed to be well educated and to become perfectly fluent. However, acquisition trumps learning. Learning will never make you fluent. Only acquisition can really make you fluent. And this is why so many people say those dreaded words that every language teacher hates to hear. Say it with me now. I took French for 4 years and I don't remember anything. And I always answer them, that's because it was taught to you incorrectly. It wasn't targeting your long-term memory, which is what we really need to do with our students. So here's something interesting. Grammar is still taught. Grammar is still used in the classroom. You don't walk around speaking in infinitives to your students. And accuracy is still what we want in the end. We want that goal. We want them to be accurate. But grammatical accuracy is the result of acquisition, not the means toward it. I'm going to repeat that. That was, by the way, a quote by my good friend Terry Wiegert. Shout out, Terry. This is a really powerful statement because as teachers, we don't want our kids to always talk incorrectly, to always talk, you know, with the incorrect grammar. But students are not going to learn the grammar first and then use it correctly. They need to acquire language, use it, and then they become more accurate as they have acquired language. And it's really it's just a whole different way of looking at it. And I want to add that being able to produce the language in speaking and in writing is the evidence that the input's actually working. So when your kids can do it, when your students can speak and read and, speak and write, it's evidence that they have been reading and that they have been listening. So really quickly, I'm just going to do this super fast. Think about our definition of input. It was reading and listening. Do any of these focus on reading and listening? The students perform a skit. Someone retells a story. They write a paragraph. There's information gap where they have to talk to each other and find out each other's what's missing on each other's page. They retell a story, or they write a story from pictures. They do a point of view. I don't know if you know what that means, but that's POV, point of view retell, where they retell the story in first person. They make a speech or they write a letter. These are all typical activities that we do in a classroom, but unfortunately, not one of these promotes acquisition because they're all production. They're all output activities. And I'm not saying that they don't have value, but they're not going to give the students the nourishment that they need, you know, the input nourishment that they need to be able to produce the language. They need more input than they do speaking and writing all the time. So Bill Van Patten says that acquisition cannot happen in the absence of input. You cannot acquire a language if you get no input. You have to hear it and understand it and read it and understand it in order to do it. So this kind of brings us back to the comprehensible input. Here's something that's important to note. Acquisition takes longer than learning. And that's what Jim noted when he did it. Acquisition takes longer than learning, but it lasts longer. It really lasts longer. And you know, you can see that when your students come back and tell you what they're doing with the language and how they're, and it's not just the 4%ers that are doing that. It's a lot of students that tell me that they still like French and they still use it. And I know other teachers have the same situations. You may be teaching a little less, but what they have, what they acquire, they have the potential to have forever. Because if they keep using it, you know, and even if they lock it away for a long time, if it's really in their long-term memory, it will come back to them when they are spending time in the target language. So just a quick review, everyone can learn a language, and people learn language based on meaning, not grammar or not form. Here's our third paradigm shift. How a student feels impacts his ability to acquire language. This is the affective filter hypothesis that Krashen has as well, Dr. Krashen has, where it says that if how a student feels impacts how he acquires language. So the affective filter is something that when Noam Chomsky talked about the language acquisition device. It's really not a real device. It's just the brain, the part of the brain that's responsible for language acquisition, but he called it the language acquisition device. We recognize that sometimes students' feelings, their anxiousness, low self-esteem, maybe a sense of not belonging to the group can put up what we call a filter. It can put up a block to the language, to the input that they're getting. And the students may actually even understand the input, but the filter might block it. The affective filter might block it from reaching that part of the brain where language is acquired. So it's that kind of explains sometimes, I think, some of our students that, and it's very rare, but there's a few that, boys, they acquire at a slow pace, and it's very hard. It can be very hard for them to acquire language, and it's less students than I used to have. More students are successful this way than I used to have, but there still is a few sometimes then, and I usually assume that there's something there that's blocking it. I try to really lower that, because actually we do impact that. It's important that we recognize that we need to keep that affective filter low, and one way to do that is through success, because nothing motivates like success. It is so powerful. By forcing students to speak before they're ready, or forcing them to use certain grammatical structures that they haven't acquired, these are the things that raise the affective filter and can really cause them to not acquire language. By keeping the affective filter low, students can acquire and they feel comfortable, and we need to keep them successful. I believe personally that learning a language should be stress-free and somewhat effortless, just like your first language. Remember, parents don't give packets to students at nap time. It's a very stress-free environment to learn your first language. And it's a major difference between acquisition and learning, because students just learn and know things over time. They just know words. They don't even know why they know them. They just do. So the big question then is, what impacts affect? Well, I really believe that your classroom environment, the way that you set up your classroom, the rules, the expectation, or I shouldn't say expectations, that comes later, but the rules, the systems, the things that you have going on, and also the climate, the atmosphere, the way that everybody feels in the room. Is it tense? Is it easygoing? What's going on? And then, of course, our expectations, which is a great segue into our last topic. These things all impact affect. So our fourth paradigm shift is the expectations of the learner. What should our end goals be? Are our targets appropriate and realistic? Well, that's a good question. We have some goals. I mean, it's logical, right? We all want students to be able to read, understand, read, speak, and write. They should be able to do that as a language student, as a person who's acquiring another language or learning another language. But here's the question that's really important to answer, and I really challenge you to go back to your colleagues and to ask this question. To what degree of accuracy? How accurate should they be? Students should be able to understand, read, speak, and write, but to what degree of accuracy? Proficiency for communication is the goal, not perfection. We're looking to make our students proficient in the language for communication purposes, not for complete accuracy. And it's important to note that being proficient and being grammatically accurate are not the same thing. Being proficient is one thing, and being grammatically accurate is completely different. They're not synonymous. You do not have to be grammatically accurate to be proficient. And I would like to say that you could probably spout off a couple things that are grammatically accurate, but you really could lack proficiency. I need to think through that one a little more, but I think that might actually be true. Okay. We must expect errors from our students. They are not going to be accurate. Listen, perfection is not on the table. So grading against perfection, like a perfectly written, even grammatical things, like if they have to perform and create a grammatical structure and they have to be perfect every time, That's not fair because errors are a part of the process. Errors are a part of the process on the ACTful proficiency scale. Communication is the goal. If the errors are causing communication errors, or communication miscommunication, I should say, then that is when the error really needs to be explored. But if they're not, then keep the communication going. The input that you're giving to students will be more beneficial to them than the grammar correction or the error correction that you have. Laura Terrell says, progress, not perfection. We need to continue to make improvements in what we do, but perfection isn't really on the table. So I don't know if you've ever seen this. I'm assuming you've seen this before. This is ACTful's Proficiency Levels. And it's kind of cone. It's a cone shape. And it's interesting. It starts down at novice, and there's 3 levels of novice, and then it's intermediate, and it's 3 levels of intermediate, and then advanced. And notice the colors sort of bleed into each other to show you that there's overlap. I mean, if you had to guess where your students would be at the end of high school, do you know where they would be? Proficiency, just in case you want to know, is defined as a functional linguistic ability in a spontaneous and non-rehearsed context. So what students are able to do with the language in a non-rehearsed, spontaneous way will determine their level of proficiency. Now, I know that I cannot officially tell you what my students' levels of proficiency are, but ACTful's given us enough indicators and enough benchmark descriptors that we can determine, we can have an idea of where they might be, and we can encourage kids to the next level, which is really what we're supposed to be continuing to do. So it's kind of important that we know that. All right, so just really quickly, before we do, we're going to do a little quiz on proficiency levels. And before we do, I wanted to ask you, do you know what proficiency level you need to be a language teacher? And I think it might differ from state to state, to be honest with you, but I'm going to give like a generic one that I've heard and I think ACTful promotes. Do you know? I'm guessing that you're thinking, and hopefully you're thinking the same thing as me. It is advanced low. Advanced low is the expectation that you need to have in the language in order to be a teacher of that language. So I really want you to keep this in mind as we start out our little proficiency quiz. Advanced low. And if you don't know what it means to be advanced low, there are some really powerful things that happen in advanced low. Advanced low is where you just begin to be regularly accurate, not all the time, but regularly accurate with past, present, and future. Those 3 tenses. That's where advanced low, you're beginning to be accurate. And you know that you have a certain level of fluency, you can handle certain situations. These are the kinds of things that happen in advanced low. Sometimes I think we just expect too much from our students. All right, so here I have an ACTful. And by the way, these are from my friend Terry Wiekert. She did these in her presentation, and I decided to use them here today just to give you some ideas. But the ACTful presentational speaking global can-do statement says, I can deliver detailed presentations, usually with accuracy, clarity, and precision. Now, I've already tooted the horn of no accuracy, no accuracy. Where do you think this falls? Do you think it's novice? Obviously, probably not. Intermediate? Advanced? Is it superior? Distinguished? Where does it fit? Well, I'm going to tell you, it's advanced high. You don't have to deliver detailed presentations with accuracy, usually with accuracy, clarity, and precision, until advanced high. You don't have to do that as a teacher. As a teacher, you're only expected to be advanced low. I'm just saying what the qualifications are. I'm just trying to show you what our expectations as teachers are. All right, here's another one. This is about interpersonal communication. I can express myself freely and spontaneously, and for the most part, accurately, on concrete topics and on most complex issues. The phrase I'd like to point out is, for the most part, accurately. So it's very possible that you would not be accurate for the most part, but you could make mistakes. Where do you think this one is? Well, this one's also advanced high. So just showing the expectations there. All right, here's our next one. I can communicate with ease, accuracy, and fluency. I mean, a lot of us expect this from our students, that they communicate to us with simple sentences easily, that they're correct, that they can do it fluently. Well, this isn't supposed to happen, folks, until superior. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think my French abilities are superior. I think I have moments, perhaps, when I am superior, but for the most part, I'm right in that advanced range and probably not advanced high. This is something that we need to recognize as teachers, that we cannot expect our students to do something that we can't do either. The next one, I can write using appropriate grammatical structures of the target language. This is huge, and I included this one because this means that you are writing accurately. You're using the correct grammar. So if you're giving a quiz, for example, on the past tense, that means that you can write using the appropriate structure of that language in past tense. Guess when you're supposed to do this? Also superior. Superior is above advanced. It is so high. Our students, and I don't know if you know this, but the AP exam is written at the intermediate high, advanced low level. So it's kind of interesting to think that our students would be expected to have their grammatical structures correct all the time. They can't remember that rule when they go to write. And we probably shouldn't force the rule when they're producing fluent language. We just need to give them more input. All right, last one. I can present skillfully and with accuracy, efficiency, and effectiveness in a variety of settings. I can present skillfully and with accuracy, efficiency, and effectiveness in a variety of settings. This is distinguished. So these are things that we just need to remember, that these aren't even on the table for some of us in English, let alone in the target language. So the proficiency levels are guidelines that are not based on any particular theory, pedagogical method, or educational curriculum. They are an instrument for evaluation of functional language ability. If you go to the ACTFL website, they have some great examples of all of these levels. In English, they have them in, I think they have them in several languages. And you can go and you can see, well, what does it sound like when a student speaks in a certain language? And what should that expectation be? And proficiency really takes time. It's not something that happens quickly. ACTFL retweeted my tweet once, and I was so excited. I said the higher that you go on the ACTFL proficiency scale, the slower you move, because proficiency takes time, and it does take time. You can't rush it. All right, we are almost close here to the end. Thanks for sticking with me if you have. Here's the important thing. We need to set good proficiency goals. We need to choose appropriate targets with realistic goals. That also impacts the affect. Students will not know everything about the language, but they will be able to use what they know proficiently. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's pretty powerful. They're not going to know everything about the language. They're not going to know every irregular preterite verb that they need to know in every form, but they will be able to use what they know proficiently. If they have it and acquired it, they're going to be able to use it, and that is going to be accessible to them when they speak in spontaneous situations. Quick reflection, how appropriate are traditional activities and assessments when compared to the proficiency goals that we should be expecting from them? I don't know if you have done this with your department, but have you taken the time to decide what proficiency level your goal is for the end of each level where you'd like students to be? Remembering that in the fall of the next year, they're still at that lower level before they get to the level that you want them to be at the end of the year. Well, I think it's important to set those goals together and to look at ACTFL's recommendations on this, because there is a certain amount of expected seat time or time in the classroom that affects the amount of time that you can do. Our ultimate goal is to keep students learning the language as long as possible. I want to remind you that comprehensible input is a philosophy. It's a mindset. It's a way of thinking. It's a belief system about language. It's not just a strategy to add to your toolbox. because it answers the question, how does language acquisition occur? So why CI? Here are some reasons. I believe it's how humans acquire language, the way we learned it, our first language. I believe that CI is the great equalizer. Everyone can acquire language this way, and you can keep students in your programs longer because you're not expecting them to do something that they can't do, and then their grades get bad and they decide not to take it. If Susie Gross used to always say, if you make it so hard for students to be successful, they're just going to quit and take art. Now, this is a problem for French teachers, German teachers, and some of our other languages that are declining over the course of the last years. It's important that we keep our students in our programs and keep them learning as long as possible, not only for them, but for our jobs as well. Another reason why CI is so important is that the content is relevant and it's engaging to students because it's about them and their world and what's going on around them. And you know your students, what do they want to talk about? What are the issues that are interesting to them? What are the things that they are inspired by? That's the stuff that you find out how to talk about in the target language. Just a couple more here. Why CI? I believe that CI can be provided in engaging, joyful ways. When I switched from a traditional textbook to comprehensible input in my classroom became joyful. We talked about things, we had interactions, we got to know each other. It was a really beautiful place where we just interacted and had a good time. Was it like that every day? No, I'm going to be realistic. But overall, in general, I love teaching this way because I can use music, I can use games, I can make crafts, I can do activities with my students that just use the target language. Another benefit is for YCI is that students can actually understand. I remember having students say to me, I don't understand you, madame, when you're saying that. What do you mean? I don't know what you mean, because I would ask them a question. So I'd write the question on the board and I'd dissect it and I'd explain all the grammar and I'd talk to them about why I wrote the question that way. And then I would pose it again and they would still look at me with blank eyes. It's because I wasn't making it understandable to them. The language didn't mean anything because I was only explaining the grammar. Another reason is that students can speak and write from their long-term memories. It is amazing to watch that growth over time. And as you continue to get better as a CI provider, you see that your students begin to improve more and more, and they continue to improve over the long term. Success is motivating. That's another reason to use CI, because it's very motivating. And FYI, it's motivating for both you as a teacher and your students in their language acquisition. Lastly, I love CI because I get to use the target language to teach the target language. It's not that I don't have to explain the language. I get to actually use it and engage my students in topics that are interesting to them. I have a video here, which I'm not going to show today, but I might, I'm going to end up putting on YouTube. So you can probably, search for it on YouTube with my name. But it's really important here as we end that you recognize that, it's a journey. Think about that classroom that you wanted at the beginning of our time together. What can you do? What tools, what philosophies, what things have to change about the way you're teaching to get to that point where you have the classroom that you want to have? I want to encourage you all to keep thinking about comprehensible input and putting it in the forefront of your learning. There's so much out there. There's blogs, there's podcasts, there's videos on YouTube, there's conferences that you can go to, workshops that you can go to. It is a great way to teach, and it's a beautiful community of teachers that enjoy working together and learning and growing. Thanks to everybody for listening, and I appreciate the opportunity to share here. Have a great day.